George stepped out of the lawyer's office, the cold winter air hitting him like a slap in the face. He pulled his coat tighter around him, but it did little to shield him from the chill that had seeped into his bones. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: betrayal, anger, and a deep, gnawing sadness. He couldn't believe it had come to this. After 24 years of marriage, he was filing for divorce. He walked slowly down the street, his footsteps echoing in the quiet afternoon. The city seemed to be moving in slow motion around him, people rushing by without a care in the world. But George couldn't focus on anything beyond the heavy weight in his chest. He kept replaying the moment in his head, the moment he discovered the truth. It had been just another ordinary day. He had come home from work, tired and looking forward to a quiet evening with Anna. But instead, he found himself staring at a piece of paper that changed everything. The land use receipt from the Ministry of Lands, with Anna's name on it. He remembered the shock that hit him like a ton of bricks. He had paid rent for their house for 20 years, never suspecting that the money was going straight to his wife. George shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind. He couldn't wrap his head around it. Anna had kept this secret from him for so long. He had trusted her completely, and she had betrayed that trust in the most unimaginable way. He felt like a fool. He stopped at a street corner, waiting for the light to change. His hands trembled as he dug into his pocket for his phone. He needed to talk to someone, to make sense of it all. But who? His friends? His family? They would all be shocked. He couldn't bring himself to call anyone just yet. Instead, he pulled up the photos on his phone, scrolling through memories of happier times. Their wedding day, their first house, the countless moments they had shared over the years. But now, all those memories felt tainted. He couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't know Anna at all. He had loved her, trusted her, built a life with her. And now, it all felt like a lie. The light changed, and George started walking again, his mind still racing. He needed to get home, to face Anna. He needed answers. But deep down, he knew that no amount of explanations could change what he had discovered. His world had been turned upside down, and he didn't know how to put the pieces back together. George sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. The room was quiet, except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator. He couldn't focus on the show playing in front of him. His mind kept drifting back to the moment that had shattered his world. It had been a typical evening. He had just gotten back from work and was waiting for Anna to return from the grocery store. They had been living in the same house for 20 years, and it felt like home. But something had been gnawing at him lately, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. Flashback to a few days earlier, George had been sitting in the living room reading the newspaper when he heard a knock on the door. He looked up, surprised. It wasn't like Anna to be home so early. He put down the paper and walked to the door, opening it to find a group of government officials standing on his doorstep. "Good afternoon, sir," one of them said, holding out a piece of paper. "We're from the Ministry of Lands. We have a land use receipt to deliver to the landlord." George frowned, confused. "The landlord? But I'm the tenant. My wife is the one who deals with the landlord." The official nodded. "Yes, sir. This receipt is for the landlord. It's a standard procedure after the land use payment is made every 10 years. George took the receipt, his heart pounding. He glanced at the name on the paper and felt the blood drain from his face. Anna's name was there, in black and white. He looked up at the officials, his mind racing. "Excuse me, but are you sure this is for the landlord?" he asked, his voice trembling. The official nodded again. "Yes, sir. The property is registered under your wife's name. She built this house 21 years ago." George's mind was spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been paying rent for 20 years, thinking it was going to some anonymous landlord. But now, he realized it had been going to Anna all along. The officials left, and George stood there, staring at the receipt in his hand. He felt a mix of shock and curiosity. He needed to know more. He remembered the room at the back of the house that Anna had always forbidden him from entering. She had always said it belonged to the landlord and that he should never open it. But now, he couldn't resist the urge to see what was inside. He walked to the back of the house, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was small, with a single door that had always been locked. He found a small key hidden under a potted plant outside and used it to unlock the door. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, he found a small desk with a drawer. He opened it and found a stack of receipts. They were all labeled as rent payments, but instead of the landlord's name, they had Anna's name on them. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized the truth. Anna had been pocketing the rent money all these years. He continued to search the room and found 2 bank account statements. They were both in Anna's name, and together they had a total of $4,000. He felt a pang of anger and disappointment. All these years they had struggled financially. There had been times when he couldn't afford medical bills, and Anna had never offered to help. She had been hiding this money from him all along. George sat down on the floor, feeling overwhelmed. He couldn't believe what he had discovered. He had trusted Anna completely, and she had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. He felt like a fool, and his heart ached with the weight of the betrayal. He stayed in that room for what felt like hours, trying to process everything. When he finally got up, he knew he had to confront Anna. He had to know why she had kept this secret from him for so long. He locked the room again and went back to the living room, waiting for her to come home. George and Anna had been married for 4 years when they decided to sell their house. It wasn't an easy decision, but they knew it was the right one. The house was old, and they needed something more modern, something that could grow with their family. They had been saving for years, and finally, they had enough to make the move. The day they signed the papers was bittersweet. They had so many memories in that old house, but they were excited for what lay ahead. After the sale, they packed up their belongings and started the search for a new place to call home. It wasn't easy. They looked at dozens of houses, each one more disappointing than the last. George was getting frustrated. He had a good job, but the cost of living was high, and finding a place within their budget was proving to be a challenge. One evening, as they were sitting at the kitchen table, going over yet another list of houses, Anna looked up at him with a smile. "George, I think I found something," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I spoke to the landlord, and he's willing to rent it to us." George's heart leaped. "Really? Where is it?" "It's just a few blocks away," Anna replied. "It's a beautiful house, and the rent is reasonable. The landlord is a bit of a recluse, though. He lives in another city and doesn't like to show his face, but he's agreed to let us move in." George was skeptical, but he trusted Anna. She had always been the more practical one, the one who could see the good in every situation. He nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "That sounds great," he said. "Let's do it." The next day, Anna brought home an account number. She said it belonged to the landlord, and they needed to transfer the first month's rent. George didn't think twice about it. He trusted his wife, and he was just happy to have found a place they could afford. They moved in, and life seemed to fall into place. The house was perfect, and they settled in quickly. George started his new job, and Anna took up a part-time position at a local bookstore. They were happy, and the house felt like home. Every year, when the renewal notice came, George would transfer the money without a second thought. He had complete trust in Anna, and he never questioned where the money was going. They lived a simple life, and George was content. But life had its ups and downs. There were times when money was tight. George had to work overtime, and they had to cut back on luxuries. Once, when George fell ill, they struggled to pay the medical bills. Anna never mentioned the extra money she had saved. She just kept quiet, and George never knew. Year after year, they renewed the lease. George would transfer the money, and life would go on. He never suspected that the money was going straight to Anna's account. He never imagined that the house they lived in was actually hers. One day, as they were sitting in the living room, George mentioned how lucky they were to have such a great landlord. "Anna, do you ever talk to the landlord?" he asked casually. Anna shook her head. "No, he prefers to stay out of things. He just wants his rent on time." George nodded, feeling a pang of curiosity. But he never pursued it. He trusted Anna, and that was enough. As the years passed, George and Anna grew older. Their children left home, and it was just the two of them again. They had been through so much together, and George felt like they had a solid, unbreakable bond. But he had no idea that beneath the surface there was a secret that would change everything. Life had its ups and downs, and for George, the downs seemed to hit harder than most. There were times when money was tight, really tight. George worked hard, often putting in extra hours at the office, but sometimes it just wasn't enough. There were months when he had to choose between paying the rent and buying groceries. Anna would always reassure him that everything would be okay, but George couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One particularly tough year, George's company went through a rough patch. Layoffs were happening, and George found himself among those let go. He tried to stay positive, but the reality of losing his job hit hard. They had savings, but it wasn't enough to last long. George started looking for a new job immediately, but the market was tough, and opportunities were scarce. Anna tried to help, taking on extra shifts at the bookstore, but it wasn't enough. The rent was due, and they didn't have the money. George felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had always been the provider, and now he couldn't even pay the rent. He felt like a failure. "Anna, I don't know what we're going to do," George said one evening, his voice trembling. "I can't find a job, and we're running out of money. How are we going to pay the rent?" Anna looked at him, her eyes filled with worry. "Don't worry, George. We'll figure something out. Maybe we can ask the landlord for an extension." But George knew that wasn't an option. The landlord had always been strict about timely payments. He sighed and looked at the notice on the kitchen table. The threat of eviction loomed over them, and George felt helpless. Days turned into weeks, and George still hadn't found a job. The rent was overdue, and they had received a notice from the landlord. George felt like he was drowning. He had to do something, anything, to keep a roof over their heads. One day, as he was going through his things, he found an old piece of jewelry that his grandmother had given him. It wasn't worth much, but it was all he had. He decided to sell it. He went to a local pawn shop and managed to get a few $100s for it. It wasn't enough to cover the rent, but it was something. When he got home, he handed the money to Anna. "Here, this should help," he said, trying to sound hopeful. Anna took the money, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, George. This will help." But George could see the worry in her eyes. He knew they needed more. He started to feel a growing sense of suspicion. Why was Anna so calm? Why wasn't she more worried about their situation? He pushed the thoughts aside, telling himself that she was just trying to stay strong for both of them. But the doubts lingered. There were times when George would catch Anna looking at her phone, a secretive smile on her face. He would ask her what she was doing, and she would just brush it off, saying it was nothing. But George couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. One day, George received a call from a potential employer. They were interested in hiring him, but the commute would be long, and the pay wasn't great. He took the job anyway, knowing they needed the money. He started working again, but the financial strain continued. They were barely making ends meet. The rent was due again, and George was struggling to find the money. He had sold most of his valuable possessions, and he was running out of options. He felt like he was at the end of his rope. "Anna, I don't know how we're going to pay the rent this month," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "I've tried everything, but I just can't find the money." Anna looked at him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of worry and calm. "Don't worry, George. I'll figure something out." But George couldn't shake the feeling that she already had a plan. He started to feel a growing sense of betrayal. Why wasn't she more worried? Why wasn't she helping him find a solution? He felt like he was fighting a battle alone. One evening, as they were sitting at the dinner table, George couldn't hold it in any longer. "Anna, what are you hiding from me?" he asked, his voice filled with frustration. "Why aren't you more worried about our situation?" Anna looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "I'm not hiding anything, George. I'm just trying to stay positive." But George could see the lie in her eyes. He felt a wave of anger wash over him. "No, Anna. You're hiding something. I can see it. You're not worried because you already have a plan. You're not helping me because you don't need to. You have money hidden somewhere, and you're not telling me." Anna's face turned pale and she looked away. "George, you're being paranoid. I don't have any money hidden. I'm just trying to stay strong for us." But George knew better. He could see the guilt in her eyes. He felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. He had trusted her completely, and now he felt like she had betrayed him. The days turned into weeks, and the financial strain continued. George kept working, but it was never enough. He felt like he was fighting a losing battle, and every time he looked at Anna, he felt a growing sense of suspicion and betrayal. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. George sat on the couch, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been waiting for Anna to come home, the broken door a silent witness to his discovery. The room felt colder, the air thick with tension. He had replayed the confrontation in his head 100 times, but nothing could prepare him for the moment when she walked through that door. Anna arrived home later than usual. She had a bag of groceries in one hand and a smile on her face, clearly unaware of what awaited her. As she pushed open the front door, her smile faded. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening in shock as she took in the sight of the broken door. "George, what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. George stood up, his face a mask of anger and hurt. "I found out, Anna. I know about the house. I know you've been taking the rent money all these years." Anna's face turned pale, and she dropped the groceries. They fell to the floor with a thud, but neither of them moved to pick them up. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "George, it's not what you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Isn't it?" George replied, his voice shaking with anger. "I found the receipts, Anna. I saw the bank statements. You've been hiding this from me for 20 years. How could you?" Tears welled up in Anna's eyes and she took a step closer to him. "I didn't mean to hurt you, George. I needed to protect us." "Protect us?" George repeated, his voice rising. "You call this protecting us? You let me struggle, Anna. You let me sell my grandmother's jewelry, and you never once offered to help. You had money, Anna. You had enough to pay the rent, but you kept it hidden. How could you do this to me?" Anna's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at the floor. "I know it looks bad, George, but I had my reasons. I was trying to save money for our future. I wanted to make sure we would always have a home no matter what happened." George shook his head, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Our future? Anna, you call this our future? You call lying to me and keeping secrets our future? I trusted you, Anna. I trusted you with everything, and you betrayed me." Anna's eyes filled with tears and she reached out to him, but he stepped back. "George, please, you have to understand. I was scared. I was scared of losing everything. I thought if I kept the money hidden, we would be safe." George felt a wave of anger wash over him. "Safe? Anna, you call this safe? You call living a lie safe? You call me selling my last piece of jewelry safe? You call me struggling to pay the rent safe?" Anna's face crumpled and she started to cry. "I'm sorry, George. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I just wanted to protect us." But George couldn't find it in him to forgive her. He felt like a part of him had died, like the trust he had placed in her had been shattered beyond repair. He looked at her, his heart heavy with disappointment. "I can't do this anymore, Anna," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't live with someone who lies to me. I can't live with someone who keeps secrets. I need to know that I can trust you, and I can't do that anymore." Anna's face fell, and she looked at him with a mix of pain and disbelief. "George, please, don't do this. We can work through this. We can fix this." But George knew it was too late. The damage had been done. He had seen the truth and he couldn't unsee it. He turned away from her, unable to look at her anymore. "I need some time to think," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to figure out what to do next." And with that, he walked out of the house, leaving Anna standing there, tears streaming down her face. The broken door stood as a silent witness to the end of their marriage, a stark reminder of the trust that had been broken. The days that followed were a blur for George. He spent most of his time in a daze, trying to process everything that had happened. The betrayal and disappointment weighed heavily on him, making it hard to focus on anything else. He couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life had been a lie. One morning, as he sat at the kitchen table staring at the same spot where Anna had stood during their confrontation, he made a decision. He couldn't stay in this house anymore. He couldn't stay with Anna. The trust between them was gone, and he didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. He picked up the phone and called a lawyer. The conversation was short and to the point. George explained the situation, and the lawyer listened carefully. By the end of the call, George had made an appointment to file for divorce. When he hung up the phone, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that he was finally taking steps to move forward, but sadness because he knew this marked the end of something he had cherished for so long. He had loved Anna deeply, and the thought of losing her was almost unbearable. As he sat there, he couldn't help but think about the future. He didn't know what it held, but he knew he had to start somewhere. He had to rebuild his life, find a new place to call home, and figure out how to move on from this betrayal. George took a deep breath and stood up. He walked to the door, looking back at the house one last time. It had been their home for so long, but now it felt like a prison. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him, ready to face whatever came next.